Dr. Kathryn Woodcock. We're really excited to have Kathryn with us. And Kathryn is the Associate Professor at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. And she's the Director of the Thrill Lab, which specializes in human factors for themed entertainment. She's starting to get more and more involved in the industry. This is her first SATE. She's engineer, advises mechanical, industrial engineering students. She's really trying to create a lot of interest within her group up there in Canada. So please welcome Kathryn Woodcock.
Good morning. I'm working without a tightrope here because I have a pole here and I'm not connecting to my file. Oh, here we go. So, since I started getting involved in the themed entertainment business about 15 years ago, every single person I met has given me very generous advice. And they have told me to do various things. Go to NARSO, go to Ames, go to IAPA, go visit the THEA award winners. And I am not ashamed to say I've taken almost every one of those pieces of advice. It's taken me all over the place looking at really fascinating things. Never once have they given me a bum steer. So when somebody says, come to the TEA SATE, I said, sure, say yes. So I'm really crossing my fingers that this isn't going to be the exception that proves the rule. The notices about rehearsals and staging and all that started to come in, and I started to wonder, maybe I have made a bad call, but anyway, you have my back, right? So the risk of disappointing your guests, the risk of disappointing your clients, the risk of disappointing your investors, that's a pretty fancy problem to have. The real ultimate risk of all is the risk of life and death. And so we're very concerned about hurting our guests. And we want to make sure that they have a good time. But if they don't have a good time, if they misbehave, particularly, if putting a point on that, if they misbehave, then we run the risk of them hurting themselves and hurting our reputations as well. But we can't avoid those guests because they pay the bills. So it's not a risk that you can afford to walk away from because otherwise you don't have a perk. So that's why I've called it the necessary risk. That's the one risk we can't walk away from. But I hope my goal is to give you some peace of mind that maybe there are some tools that we can use from human factors to realize that it's not such a dire risk after all. And let's hope my connection is lost. So I like to think of my field of human factors engineering as aligned to themed entertainment. Human factors engineering is the branch of engineering that looks at human beings as a component, similar to other engineering components, where you look at wood. Wood has certain properties, and there's some variation, but it behaves a certain way. You look at steel, it has certain properties, it behaves a certain way, plus or minus a little bit, electronic components, and so on and so forth. Well, so do people. People vary more than steel or wood, but people have a certain range of performance. It's not like you're going to get a guest that comes in with 3 legs. They might have 1 leg, they might have no legs, but they won't have 3 legs. So you have a certain range of behaviors and perceptions and that sort of things. So whereas themed entertainment creates an experience that evokes an emotion, human factors engineering is focused more on describing and predicting how people will react in a certain situation. And we might look into more mundane types of human performance that's not so exciting and emotional as some of the things that designers do. Things like, why did the operator misoperate that control? Or why did the guest walk the direction they did instead of the direction I wanted them to walk? Or why did the inspector approve that ride when it obviously had a defect in it? So human factors gives us that descriptive and predictive tool. Many professions, including my dear friends in other branches of engineering, tend to look at human beings in a more prescriptive way, more normative way. I've come up with a design of a device that works perfectly well, and now I'm going to give training. and I'm going to give instructions, and I'm going to write a manual, and people are going to operate it in accordance with the way I've described it. They don't have any space for predicting alternate ways of behaving. And so when they do behave in those alternate ways, they label those an error. It deviates from the intention that I want it. I know the device works, why aren't they using it that way? Now, to be sure, there is involvement of error in a lot of things that go bad. If you look at the data from my home province of Ontario in Canada, 94% of the ride injuries that are reported in a recent year were associated with human behavior, rider behavior. 4% were related to deficiencies of the regulated technologies that the regulator had jurisdiction over, and I'm not really sure what fell through the 2% crack, maybe investigations that didn't go anywhere. 94%, that's a pretty big wedge of the pie to be concerned about. So how do we protect ourselves from unsuitable human behavior, human performance? That's where the human factors comes in. Now, to be sure, there is a certain amount of human behavior that is poor judgment, even jackassery. The human has used the equipment improperly, I guess would be the way to say it. The human factors way of looking at these errors is that they're systems failures. So for instance, okay, now I've lost my network again. I have lost my hello. The Wizard of Oz, okay. So an attraction, like any device, is part of a system. So you have the mechanical conveyance, but it is a product. The product of the ride is not the mechanical motion of a piece of machinery along a certain path, enhanced with sound and light and smells and song and dance. The product of the system is fun. So if you take this ride and take the patrons off, it's not a ride anymore, it's a device. It's only a ride when you have the happy boy on it, or happy girl, or happy mothers and dads. The guest is not a consumer of a product. The guest is not even a raw material where you take the human and you apply a certain amount, a certain dosage of ride and show, and then their emotion turns to happy. The guest is a component of the system. The component, has a job to do, just like tube has a job to carry fluid from a vessel to another vessel. The guest is a component of the system. So they have a certain functionality like any other component, and they have certain characteristics. Obviously, fun is subjective, so preferences are involved, and the demographics and all of that stuff of what people find enjoyable. It's also in terms of what knowledge they have. They can't understand your metaphors if they don't have that knowledge. It's also objective in terms of physical. Maybe their body doesn't find it enjoyable. So they take that subjective perspective and they take the objective perspective, and then they experience the ride, the mechanical motion, and then it's successful or not. So it's only fun if it's fun for them. And so a lot of fun-seeking behavior turns out to be the same behavior we call errors when something bad happens. The guests know their job is to have fun. They're aware of their functional role in the system. And so if it's not enough fun, what they're trying to do is to complete your design. So, you can see he's putting his semicircular canals into a different position because he's aged out of that ride. He's probably there because his mother says, "God damn it, your little sister wants to go on this ride. You get on that ride." So there he is. Now, similarly, attractions may tease guests with illusions and mysteries, like we tell them they're going to Mars, and they're not really going to Mars, and I think they believe that they're not really going to Mars, but they're willing to buy into the illusion. We tease them with illusions. We bombard them with an avalanche of stimuli, and then when they can't cope, the engineering soul says, "J'accuse." You didn't do something right because you had inattention. You didn't do something right because you lacked situation awareness. So to manage the risk of guest behavior, we make rules to limit who can participate, to reduce the amount of people who will be in that scenario. So we associate unsafe behaviors with immature judgment. that's too young to participate. So we have height restrictions that we associate with a certain eligible age. And by the same logic, many rides restrict the participation of people with disabilities. Now, the ride restrictions may use other words like handicap or special needs, but rarely do they use words that actually tell you what their real concern is. In one study of 100 ride manuals, we reviewed all of the eligibility criteria, and we found half of them had restrictions of people with disabilities, and almost none even implied what their thinking was, what was the risk rationale that would restrict a person with any type of disability for getting on the ride. Now remember, if you restrict people with disabilities, you are restricting 15 to 20% of the population, as well as anybody who is in their circle of companions who is going to reject the attraction because that member of their family or their party can't go. So it's a really big demographic issue to be concerned about. Now, what I mean by clarifying the risk rationale is that if you have a concern with the physical security of the ride restraint, what you're really concerned with is the body shape and size. So the number of appendages and the way the body would fit with the restraint and containment system. If that's your concern, then those are the people who should be on the bubble for eligibility. We wouldn't need to restrict people with autism or blindness or deafness, because that has nothing to do, it has no bearing on the restraint and containment system. If impulse control is a problem, then we need to associate that eligibility with anybody with impulse control issues, and not, for instance, people with autism and Down syndrome, unless we have evidence that that is an associated factor, and we have evidence that there's nobody else who falls into that impulse control bucket. Now, if you think people with disabilities are the only people with impulse control issues, I would like to introduce you to another population I like to call 14-year-olds. So this sign has a reference to hearing aids, whether internal or external. Now, that affects a lot of people now, people wearing hearing aids. Now, I understand that the rationale for that is to do with magnetic braking. I personally have a cochlear implant, and I'm aware that there's contraindication of magnetic fields. I can't have an MRI, for instance, unless they explant the implanted component. However, the sign excludes anybody with any kind of hearing aid, including in the ear, behind the ear, in the canal. And the rationale of the magnetic field seems to be compelling it. But I have doubts whether the magnetic brake is going to reach the skull, particularly when you consider that the magnetic field it takes to harm a cochlear implant or a hearing aid is much higher than the magnetic field required to wipe out your credit card magnetic stripe, and it's closer to the magnetic brake than your head is, for most of us. Or your mechanical watch. So I don't see any contraindication for those. Why are you telling me I went to this park, I couldn't ride a single ride? Because they were being nervous Nellies about the magnetic field of their magnetic brakes. And I didn't want to break the ride rules, but I've ridden on lots of things with magnetic brakes, so I don't know what the deal is. So I think the philosophy is better safe than sorry. That's what's driving all of this. And the assumption is that if there's no exposure, there is no risk. But that's not true. That no one knows better than TEA members how much attractions enrich and contribute to our lives. They enlighten, engage, and amaze ladies, gentlemen, and children of all ages with terrifying, thrilling, and fantastic experiences. And if you deprive people of that, that's an important thing to take away from their lives. Attractions set the stage for social interactions among people, among their friends and family. And isolation and inactivity contribute to poor mental and physical health for people with disabilities because they can't participate. Of course, that risk isn't a risk that's borne by the operator or the manufacturer. That risk of isolation and inactivity, that's borne only by the person with disabilities. So in their wisdom, jurisdictions have shifted some of that risk over to parks with things like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, trying to shift that responsibility back to the operators who need to provide that accommodation. So now, both the guest and the operator need to know why it is that somebody would not be allowed to ride. So we need to understand what specific mismatches are involved with people not coping functionally well with the ride. Is that mismatch really disability of the rider? The data don't show that disability are overly represented within people who are injured or report injuries on a ride. Obviously, we don't have data from people who weren't allowed to go on ride. But if you're looking at attractions ground zero in Orlando, you find some major operators that don't impose a great many restrictions, and yet you don't find a lot of overrepresentation of people with disabilities. Disability status is not routinely collected. Height, weight, serial number, do you have a disability, yes or no? It's not that kind of a variable, but it tends to come up if you're working your way back in the description of the accident, what has happened. If it seems relevant, it will come up in the story, and yet it's not seeming to show up in the accident reports. Particularly if you're looking at, let's say, cognitive reasoning and impulse control being a factor in riders being injured as a result of disability, you'd expect it to show up in accidents of the types of jumping out impulsively and slipping and falling and tripping as they try to escape something that they're overwhelmed with and they can't manage. But if you look at the types of injuries that have come up in about 5 years of quarterly reports, we see a spectrum of types of events there. And if I superimpose the ones that mentioned any kind of pre-existing condition, none of them were in that fall and trip category. We do see other kinds of patterns. We look at primarily in the medical characteristics of people with illness, pre-existing illness. But we do see other kinds of patterns. We see mature adults tripping in and out of ride vehicles and on moving walkways because they can't see very well in the dim light or they're clumsy. And we don't restrict older adults from going on attractions. We see prevalence of motion sickness, and we know there are certain population groups that are a little bit more prone to motion sickness, but we don't make restrictions based on ethnicity because we believe a certain ethnic group has a predisposition to motion sickness. We see people getting pinched on the arm and the leg because they misunderstand when the ride is in the station and they stick their arm out at the wrong time and they get pinched, or their leg. In carnival rides, we've observed preteen and teen riders trying to have social interaction with their companions, and so they lean out to experience an overly familiar ride and pose for ride vehicles and ride photos and that sort of thing. So using human factors engineering, we look to find person-machine mismatches behind this. We're looking at anthropometry of size and shape and fit. That's what you conventionally think of as ergonomics. You might remember this artwork from the old dear departed version of Test Track. But there's more to ergonomics. In fact, the step before anthropometry in ergonomics is function allocation. Deciding what is done by the person and what is done by the machine. Now, we always allocate restraint and containment to the machine. Nobody's ever held in a ride by hanging on with their fingers because, they should be able to pass out and not be fatally ejected from the ride. We always allocate the function of having fun to the person because the machine can't have fun on their behalf. But we used to allocate to the person the function of remaining in the right posture in the ride vehicle so that everything would be fine. And now we're discovering that we can't do that anymore because expectations have changed. And so people are adopting other kind of innovative postures in order to complete your design. And they assume that anything they can do within the restraint and containment system is A-OK. And so now we find that in order to control their postures, we have to add more restraints. And so we end up with lap bars, or lap belts added, or knee bolsters added to try and confine the postures of these people so that they can't get too creative, because the function of remaining in the posture, the design posture that the engineer expects, you can't allocate that to the person anymore. And then the purists are upset because the experience isn't the same as it used to be, but you can't always predict which people. You can't just put straitjackets on the naughty people because you don't know which people those are. So see if you can... You see that guy trying to stand up? Now the girl. And now the guy again. You wouldn't expect a nice family with a parent and a teenager, you wouldn't expect them to be the daredevils. And I also was a little bit alarmed that nobody is stopping the ride, you know. Another function that the guests have to perform is physically tolerate, you know, the cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, musculoskeletal tolerance of the ride. They also have to do that. And if we take out all of those things that challenge people, you don't want to fundamentally alter the experience. It's no longer the roller coaster then. So we have to focus on self-identifying and guest self-screening out. And it's difficult for the operator to screen them out because you might have discriminatory overtones of maybe ethnic susceptibility or age-related vulnerability to strain or gender sensitivity to certain fright cues or disability effects of understanding operator instructions. And good luck with screening out people that you think might be pregnant. Guests need more information about the attraction. They know what their characteristics are. You don't have to explain to them what deafness means, what blindness means. They understand what that means. They don't know what the attraction does. If you explain more to them about what the attraction does, they will self-select more effectively. But if you just say people with blindness, and I mean blindness and people with partially sighted, then they will say, well, are you really screening me out because you need to, or are you just one of those people who believe that I'm not a part of polite society? They're skeptical because they've been screened out too many times before. They need to know what the ride is like. Now, this doesn't mean ever more verbose warning signs or even clever videos. And some of the video warnings are plenty clever, but even that is limited. Even if you have big, prominent, concise, unambiguous indications, that's not the answer. The human factors approach is to make visible the invisible. So it calls on talents that nobody has better than TEA creative designers. Make visible the invisible. And I'm not meaning labeling things so that people can see labels about what things are. We want to embody critical elements of the safe boundaries in a way for the guest to just know what it's okay to do and what's not okay to do. The attraction, ideally the cue and the pre-show, would condition people and frame them towards what's going to happen in the attraction so that they can self-select out if it's not an appropriate experience for them, preferably towards a respectable alternate experience, not just sitting there in the baby switch waiting for the other members of their party to come. Now let me be personal. Growing up, like every middle-class Ontario family, we had a family cottage, and at the cottage I had a canoe. And I would paddle out into the middle of the lake and I'd just sit there. I have no idea why, it just seemed like a thing to do. But if there was a spider in the canoe, he could have it. I would jump out of the canoe, swim back through least infested weeds to the cottage, and somebody else would have to go out and tow the canoe back. I'm not being in any canoe with a spider. Now imagine I'm on a ride and you entertain me with a spider. Even if I can't get out of the ride vehicle, I'm going to hate you with extreme prejudice. If you give me a hint of what's to come, maybe I can prepare myself. For instance, spoiler alert, there are spiders in the Forbidden Journey of Harry Potter. And I will ride it because I know as soon as the dragon breathes fire, I cover my eyes until the spitting stops. Now, I probably wouldn't get on a ride called arachnophobia. I probably wouldn't get on a ride that's called Princess Buttercup and the Fairy Tale Ponies if I knew there were spiders in it. So for me to understand what that fear cue is, if you put a lot of spiders in the queue, then I can say, oh geez, this is not my jam, I'm out of here, and I can avoid it because I know it's not right. So once I'm on the ride, my understanding of what's going on is shaped by the ecology of the environment. And when my fun is falling short and I need to complete your design, I evaluate. Now, this isn't a decisional kind of thing like, oh, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do car surfing. It's I'm appreciating from my environment what things are possible and what effects will happen if I do them. So it's not a conscious risk assessment by the guest. It's doing something they believe to be not risky. They believe it's a plausible, effective, reasonable thing to do. I'm just using the cues you put in your environment to determine what is safe and appropriate for me to do. So for instance, I like to use this little list, a bulleted list of the properties of things convey their use. If it's open, it's closable. If it's raised, it's lowerable. If it's a button, it's pushable. If it's a knob or a wheel, it's turnable. If it's a slot, things can be inserted into it. And like, if you ever doubt that, you should go. Most emergency departments have a trophy case in a pediatric hospital, a trophy case of all the things they've taken out of children's noses. If it's horizontal, flat, smooth, and dry, you can sit on it, place things on it, and there's if there's no opening, you're meant to go around it. If there's resistance, you're meant to apply force elsewhere. If unexpected results occur, the wrong action was taken. This, the properties of things convey their use. This ride here, a little girl was enjoying this carnival ride, about 12 years old, and as it slowed to a stop, she extended her willowy 12-year-old leg out through the door to land on the step because she wanted to race for the entrance to re-ride. She was really enjoying the ride. Unfortunately, that flat, smooth, dry surface that she could see immediately outside the door opening was not a step, even though the last time she had interacted with it, it was a step, because when she got into the ride, she stepped on it before she got into her seat. However, that flat surface was the sweep of the revolving ride, and her foot was caught between the sweep and the ride vehicle, and she ended up in the hospital getting her ankle set in the fracture clinic. Obstructing the door is obviously an answer, but to most of us here, we wouldn't be able to get our leg out the door because we have legs that are not willowy 12-year-old thighs, and we wouldn't be able to extend our leg. I wouldn't certainly be able to do that. So a sticker saying, "Keep legs inside," has no weight. If your leg can go outside, then, and you see a plausible thing for doing with your foot outside the door, you see the step right outside. The human factors prescription is, if you don't want 12-year-old girls to step on something, make it invisible, cover it with something that looks unstable or slopey or slippery or dangerous, make it off-level or beveled, or cover it with broken glass or fluffy bunnies. 12-year-old girls don't step on those things. So build in the affordances of the environment, the risk barriers that you want the guests to understand. What the environment is saying is drowning out what else you are saying. So people are perceiving cues from the environment. So, for example, the environment is telling you how you ride a roller coaster. You see other people do it. You see it in commercials. You see it in print ads. It's physically possible to do it. There's no forcing function on the seat that prevents you from doing that, and so you're going to do it. And it is really fun, right up until the moment it's not. So that's the ride has to give you that forcing function. The difference between the adult and the child in this flume ride. The child knows exactly where the center of mass is and where she can position herself to go down over the brink of the ride, and from experience, over and over riding the ride. You can tell she's had a lot of experience because she's looking at the on-ride photography. This is an official souvenir photo. She knew where the camera was for the on-ride photography. The adult on the ride is a little bit uncertain and is holding on, behaving very conservatively. Natural self-preservation is not a decision. He didn't say, well, I'd like to do what she's doing too, but I'm a mature adult and I think I'll hold on because the sign said hold on. No, he's holding on for dear life. And that's a powerful tool for designers. Make things look every bit as dangerous as they are, maybe even a little more dangerous. And they don't have to be the actual thing that's dangerous. If you expect people to forget your illusion and hold a portion of their mind for the real world, you've ruined the fun. It's like the level roller coaster. You've taken away the fun. As soon as you expect them to have situation awareness of the real world, you've failed to make a fun attraction. But what you can do is put danger cues that are authentic within the narrative of the attraction, that mirror, that map on exactly to the dangers of the actual world, and then they can react to what's happening in the illusion and the fantasy. So, let's see. So the attraction creates a rich world of illusion, and we don't want to have guests have to remain aware of the parameters of the real world. We have the real safe boundaries there. We need to align the boundaries of safe behavior within the illusion world with the boundaries of the real world. anticipate that some guests will want to personalize and modify their experience and give them safe tools to do that. That's a trend today. People want personalization and customization and use it to control where they are. Like the teacup ride, what should have happened with those people in the teacup ride is they should have all had their hand on the steering wheel to make it go faster. They shouldn't have been standing up to make it more exciting. The risk is not inherent in the guest. The risk is a mismatch between the guest and the attraction, and it's critical that we use all the design resources that we have to make that meaningful and rational within the guest experience and keep the turnstiles going around, because the guest is the necessary risk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So I think we're going to open it up for a few questions for Kathryn. Is anybody? We have folks with their microphones out and about, and yeah.
This is for Kathryn. How would you be able to reconcile? I know you mentioned, spoiler alert, when you're mentioning on the warning signs, like it's important to describe what's happening on the ride, but how can you reconcile the fact that the element of surprise is really important in an experience, and how can you preserve that while still being able to explain what to expect to guests with disabilities or what have you?
I think sometimes there are going to be situations where you don't spoil everything for everybody, but you make it clear within the culture of your environment that anybody who has an issue can ask. So that if I go to guest relations, for instance, in the park and say, I'm not very keen with the spiders, where should I not go? People will be forthright with me because I have disclosed that about myself, and they should share that with me. You don't need to have an attendant at the entrance to the ride saying, warning spiders, although one of the most effective warning signs I ever recall is at Dinosaur in Disney's Animal Kingdom, where there's a sign that says, warning, loud noises and big scary dinosaurs. And if you know the attraction, you know, really, that's pretty much it, right? So you don't need to know much else to be safe on that ride, but if loud noises or big scary dinosaurs are not your jam, then that's not the ride for you. So I think you can communicate some of that without ruining the experience. But I think I'm with you in the sense of if you can try to symbolically or parallel the things that are going to bug those people about the ride, present those same cues to them before they get on the ride without saying, oh, by the way, this is what the ride looks like. But if people have a autistic sense of the tactile, make things in the ride cue, make it so it will repel them before they even get to that other thing. So use your cue. The cue is not just a holding pen. The cue is a place for perceptual framing of what's going to happen next. So use that environment, and maybe you'll have people making better choices. Or like, oh, is this awful experience ever going to stop? I think I'll ask somebody. And so they'll say, no, if you don't like the stickiness here, that's even more sticky in there. And then they'll say, good, I'll be in the snack bar. That's what I would say from a human factors point of view. You don't want to spoil it. I understand the creative purpose, but try to shape it in a way that they know that it's coming.
Do we have another question? Oh, we got one. How about all the way in back? Yeah.
I don't mean to continue on the question that we just went over, but I really liked how you talked about sensitivity to things that people are uncomfortable with. Personally, I have a phobia of dolls, but I don't go out and say, oh, can I ride this? Because are there dolls? Is it going to freak me out? But I like that you make it a design opportunity, that we can play a part in the queue line of a ride or in a story to, I'm not going to say cater to people's needs, but there is the question of people are so sensitive now and everybody wants to be catered to in that way. But you make it like a design opportunity for us to have an out for someone who may be uncomfortable, but how are we to know? So I liked that.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more quick question. How about up there towards the back?
One question.
Oh boy.
So all of your concepts of providing those cues, I think, is brilliant. And how do we as designers activate the right resources and assets to come in and say, hey, you should try this in your attraction because I see this as a potential issue for folks that might have a phobia or who don't understand fully what they're about to experience. What are those resources and how do we get in touch with them?
Yeah, I think you need to talk to the engineering people who are able to tell you where the safe boundaries are of the ride, like they do with the reach envelope. They know where the forces up out of the seat will be, where the person could defeat the containment of the ride vehicle and that sort of thing. So you'll be able to identify those kinds of environments, and you can look at, for instance, what's the worst that could happen? If the worst that could happen is somebody is uncomfortable, people with disabilities, if we're talking specifically about that population, people with disabilities have the right to do unpleasant things. You shouldn't insulate them from things that are unpleasant. They have the right to be uncomfortable just like everybody else. You might be motion sick in a simulator, but golly, you want to see that ride, so you say, I'm going to hold my nose and I'm going to do it once for science. They want that right too. So as long as they understand, this is going to be uncomfortable, but you will be alive at the end of it, then you're okay, really, as long as they really are making an informed consent thing. So I think what we need to do is stop fearing, especially people with disabilities, stop fearing that they're bone china. They're normal people who have normal lives, and every one of you has somebody in your life, if not yourself, that is in that position. And so they're exactly the same as every other guest, whether it's a normal guest with a peculiar phobia or a disability that's a sensory limitation. So everybody should be able to ride any ride as long as it's not going to kill them or cause them irreversible permanent harm. So just try to make sure they know what they're getting into.
Excellent. Kathryn, thank you very much for Dr. Kathryn Woodcock.